Thank you very much. I am conscious of the need to be concise and not to ramble on. So I've cut off two slides, which were basically going to talk about what the subject is, which is basically the issue of looking at silence not as something that is disempowerment and forced on you, but silence that is also can be powerful, it can be important, it can, sorry, I was thinking I can just work from here. And so that voice can be disempowering and silence can be powerful. So this is actually a project that emerged. There's a little bit of a history with it, in that I've been involved in writing and activism and basically work in Asia as well as Africa around gender and development for a long time. And I think that it's most of the early work on gender, women, gender, and development has assumed that the issue was to find the voice of women and to publicize the voice of women, and it was all about women's action, women's public voice, public speaking. And I think that at the time, that was the problem that we were set to solve. You know, we were seeing the issue of women not having a public voice, not having a voice that could make a difference. We were seeing that as the issue that has to be overcome. And silence was pretty much seen as the negative that we were fighting against. And so it's taken a long time for me to begin to think, well, maybe is silence always being silenced? Is silence always something that is just a negative, disempowerment? Does it have no character of its own that could be more positive? And so that began to make me think about silence as an issue. And in fact, it led to, when I was involved in teaching and writing about gender and development, I wound up in a quarrel with Naila Kabir on this, because I had written about how gender is a form of she defined gender as voice and agency. And she said women and power has to be centered around women finding their voices and speaking out, not only understanding their problems, but speaking out about them. And Naila Kabir had that as a central definition of what empowerment is. And I had been involved in a book on empowerment in about 2003. And at first I thought, okay, I can see that. And then I began to think that actually, is it always disempowering? Is silence never something that can be an action? Is silence something that's always an absence, a negative? And I began to think about this, and in 2010, I wrote an article called Choosing Silence. That was sort of my first foray out into saying, maybe we need to think about silence differently. Maybe silence is not always disempowering. Maybe it can be also a form of action, a form of agency. And I got quite a bit of feedback, negative feedback to that, because I was basically undermining one of the basic assumptions that voice is the thing that we have to focus on. That if women don't have voice, then they don't have power, then they don't exist. And so by getting into this, kind of arena, I then sort of began to think, well, maybe I need to think about the issue of women's voices more. And I began to look at the classic literature on gender and development, which was so focused on the struggle for women's voices to come out. And this is a historic struggle, and I think I began also to see we have to ask the bigger question: how is the issue of voice and silence embedded in historic change? And look, going back to the Grimke Sisters in the United States in the 1830s, they gave, one of them in particular was very, very profound and a great speaker, and she gave a talk in Boston in a public arena, one of the big halls. And the next day, the Boston newspapers had headlines saying, "Grimke Sisters speak in public." And it was regarded, and that reminded me of the fact that, all around the world, there has been a tendency towards seeing the issue of women and voice as always possibly problematic or even dangerous. And so I began to look at the mainstream gender literature around women's struggle for a better life, for a better position, and the role of voice in that. And was there anything in that where we could say that silence was a problem or not? And I think that when you look at the initial struggle and then you look at the struggle picking up again in the gender and development literature in the 70s, 60s and 70s, you begin to see that the historic struggles for women's voice and women's public voice was a key issue, and that dominated not only the women's movement in the global north, but it also affected the way the gender and development discussions and actions were emerging in the 1980s and 90s, when we were looking for ways to help women all around the world, women in the global south, to get what we thought was needed for women, which was to help them gain voice and to be able to speak out. So there was a way in which the assumptions that were embedded in the global north's gender conflicts were then just put into the gender and development world as the assumption that this is what this is what was normal, and this is what, and the solutions, for instance, get this a little closer, the gender and development institutions, and I was involved in quite a lot of gender and development activities in Canada, and that it was basically about women as peacemakers. It's continued, this focus on gender and women and girls and speaking out as being the solution to everything has been characteristic of the girl effect. The girl effect was this idea that you give a girl a cow and then she's takes care of it, and the next thing you know, there are 2 cows, and then there are 3 cows, and then the men invite the little girl to a council, and then they hear her, and then they respect her, and so then she becomes an important person, and she makes the difference. The whole idea being a kind of fantasy about the ability of girls to overcome patriarchy everywhere in the world. And so that, I think, became a very important, to me, that was like a red flag. It was like saying, okay, there's something here that's missing. There's something that we're not really seeing. And so, and then also we see then also in the development industry a failure to really pay attention to to masculinities and to gender and to patriarchy, so that it's still the women, you know, the good little brave woman is going to get the money from our project, is going to go out and make a difference. But it was very much embedded in the assumptions about how the world works from the global north. Good. So then, I think this is where we have to begin to ask questions about the emergence of resistance from the global south to what it is that is seen as normal for gender and normal for gender relations. And I'm not saying that basically I think we began to get some important scholarship coming up from the global south that has been arguing that you cannot just take a northern perspective, that especially this assumption that liberal or neoliberal solutions are the solutions for everyone. And so that began to be questioned. And I think some people in the development world and in the northern gender movements, women's movements, began to understand that maybe we need to look at the world differently. We can't just assume, we can't read the world off our experiences of being women. And so I think the women and gender relations, we began to see that women and gender relations are embedded in economic, cultural, and political institutions, and that there's a great deal of variation. I think that's the thing. The post-colonial is beginning to really say, hey, we're not all the same. And that's very important because especially when the global north had most of the money, you know, money talks. And often so the assumptions about how gender was to be dealt with in the north were just plunked on to the global south. And I think so we began to understand the need to focus on, it's difficult for me, to require a focus on gender inequality and gender relations around the world. And I think we began this is not just gender and development community, but it's also the women's movement, I think, began to have to deal with some very serious, complex scholarship coming out of all over the world that raised questions that made it clear that you couldn't just read like something like the girl effect. I still, to this day, am amazed that the girl effect didn't bring down the wrath of feminists, but it just, you know, went along as this easy idea, and that yet now, as we've begun to get a more deeper, complex understanding of gender operating around the world in different ways, in different contexts, with so many differences, that we began to see that the absolute need to stop plunking northern solutions and northern answers onto people concerned with gender inequality all around the world. I'm not saying that there isn't, there's still the same concern, I think, about gender inequality, because gender inequality exists all over the world. But it's the idea that we really need to also think about the diversity. But initially, I think that it was very much of in the feminist post-colonial interventions, you do start getting more attention to cultural, economic, and social and political institutions and practices around gender around the world. And you begin to get the development of a more comparative scholarship, which I think is very important. I think the politics of gender equality in particular life worlds becomes much more something that people are talking about and writing about, and that's very, very important. In that, I think the role of silence it took a while, I think, for silence to be seen as anything more than silenced. But post-colonial scholarship actually started to discuss silence sort of obliquely in certain ways, and it's now become a bigger discussion. But initially, I think we looked at, for instance, the scholars writing on the Ubuntu movement in Africa. They managed to take apart and say, okay, you know, the Ubuntu movement in Africa reflects the continuing of gender hierarchies, but it also provides spaces where of difference, of ways in which gender relations are seen in different ways. And I'm realizing I need to get can I get my glasses? I really can't read my writing. So that's okay. I'm just starting to think about some different cases around the world where, that's much better, right? I was gonna think I can do it without glasses, but no, I can't, right? So the thing about Ubuntu is that it begins to make the argument, you know, that voice is not the same in Africa in many societies, and that we have to see, and that there are times when silences are actually crucial part of the way in which gender relate to each other and the way in which gender is seen. And one of the most important books, one of my most favorite books, by Saba Mahmood. She unfortunately died early, but she spent 2 years with the Pietists in Egypt. She did the most amazing field work. She embedded herself in this organization where patriarchy appeared to be in charge of everything. It was very patriarchal. On the surface, the leaders were men. And so at first she assumed that women in that organization were really being oppressed and really being kind of the classic Western notion of gender oppression. And then she began, it's a good thing, she stayed for 2 years and she got so embedded, she talked to the women in the Pietist movement and she began to see them, they began to say to her things like, well, I really have a great feeling of goodness and value because of my knowledge of and attention to religious practices, modesty, and the silences, as well as voice. So she concluded in the end that within this patriarchal institution, there were spaces where women were able to construct their own understanding of being there and to actually feel empowered, and that this empowerment included the judicious use of silence as well as voice. So I found her work very interesting. And then, so I was looking all around the place for sort of more to let me know how silence and power can work together. In China, I found a very interesting work about the way in which women in many Chinese families, which were very patriarchal in terms of their structure, men were the ones that were supposed to be in charge and make the rules. Yet, this author discovered that there was a way in which women developed sort of proper practices within the family structure that often involved silences rather than direct confrontation, and that the women involved in this felt empowered by this. It was agency for them. It was not just oppression, that they could understand it differently. And among the Apache people, the amazing work of Keith Basso, he discovered that the native communities of the Apache tribe, or nation, I think it's better, nation, that they often had, in fact, that they had about 6 key elements in proper behavior for citizens that required silence, that silence was part of their lifestyle and community, and that if you didn't know the rules, and if you spoke out when you were supposed to be silent, that actually could be very disempowering, and you could wind up with very negative consequences. So that basically we begin to see in some scholarship that silence is not always being silent. Silence can also be a way in which people organize their lives, understand themselves, and relate to the world and to each other. So this began my journey. I started thinking, well, I know that I'm always used to the idea that silence is a negative force. Silence is something you're not looking forward to. You're not trying to understand because it's just a negative thing you want to end. But actually, I think that I began to see that silence often seen as disempowering. It's often seen that way, especially in the West, but in other places too. But that it can also be powerful, and that's what I began to understand. I began to think, how can silence sometimes provide an avenue for not only understanding, but also for acting and for making change? And so I began to think about a more complicated approach to silence, and I started reading across the literature. And the literature on silence there's some feminists, there's philosophy, there's so many different places, communications, anthropology, religion. I've been reading across the literature, looking for the way in which I can understand silence not as being simply silence, but silence also as potentially powerful. And that has been quite an interesting journey. I began to see silence as a gesture, as a form of communication. It can be as powerful as speech. It can be a source of comfort and reassurance, as well as a site for strategizing and resistance. It's more complicated in our complex global world, but it's been there for generations, for thousands of years. So silence began to have take a kind of life of its own. I began to ask myself, now what is it about silence what are the levels, what are the kinds of things that can make silence a positive force? I began to realize that at the most basic level, you can ask the question, silence as a coping mechanism. I mean, haven't we all felt that? Sometimes things are just getting out of hand, and the best thing is to just withdraw into yourself and spend time alone. That silence actually can be a choice. It's the deliberately unspoken. I like that definition of silence, that it can be not silence, but it can also be the deliberately unspoken. And it can be a refuge. It can provide space for agency. One of the examples that I like to talk about is the way in which silence, particularly in conflicts, can be a safe space. And sometimes also silence as a choice on what to say and what not to say. For example, the very important work on the Balkan struggles, where there was incredible amount of rape. One of the Zarkov, I think is her name, she and a number of other specialists in that region have realized that after the conflict was over, and even during it too, there was constant questions being asked of people involved in the war. Did you get raped? Were you raped? Did you let yourself be raped? And what they discovered was there was a very wide consensus, an unwritten, unspoken consensus that no, there are certain things that you don't talk about. So there's certain things that you say didn't happen to you, but they did. But then is that a disempowering choice, or is that a choice where you've decided to say something that you know is not necessarily true, but it's necessary? It's a choice about when to speak and how and why and for what end. And so I think that is like the first, what I call silence as coping, a coping mechanism. But I think silence can also enable reflection, healing, rethinking one's position. And I have a lovely quote here, which I want to read, by Stone. This is a scholar who is writing, and she's saying, there is a silence in which you have no voice, but there's also a silence in which you have chosen not to express your voice. That's a nice place. It's a place of freedom, ultimate and total freedom, so much that it is a more spacious voice. So here they're saying silence can be a spacious voice. It can be a space where you can understand and express yourself, but not with words. And so I found that very, very powerful. And then it also can provide a space for more intelligent choices. Audre Lorde has a wonderful quote where she says, it can be a place of refuge. Silence can be a place of refuge. A time for oneself, a site for pushing away competing voices and developing new dreams and visions. So silence is beginning to emerge as a space that has great potential in many different ways. Max Pickard, the famous philosopher from the 50s, said, silence is spiritual rather than material. And he said, there is more help and healing in silence than in all the useful things. I love that quote. And the Buddhists, of course, have made a fine art out of meditation, and silence is deeply embedded in the way they see the world. But I think it's also, silence can also be a platform for organizing resistance, strategizing, organizing resistance, and healing. So it can produce calm mental and physical space to think calmly, to strategize how to challenge oppressive forces. Audrey Rich has a wonderful quote. She says, silence can be a plan, rigorously executed. I'm trying to see am I on 2? Right, okay. Sorry, now I'm on to 3. Silence can be a place rigorously executed. Do not confuse it with any kind of absence. And Anita Hill is a good demonstration of how silence and voice can be interwoven and also intermittent. She was harassed by the person, yes, what is the name? I'm blanking. Yeah, Clarence, yeah. Thomas, yes, Clarence Thomas. And so she had endured a lot of harassment from him. And in that situation, she was junior and she didn't feel really safe to speak out and just come right at him. So she chose silence then. So this is where we start to get into this idea of choosing silence. Then later on, when he was being nominated and vetted for being a Supreme Court judge, reminds me a bit of Kavanaugh's story, she had to really look inside herself and think very deeply about the fact that she had put this all away. She had decided to deliberately not speak in public about this. And she decided that she had to speak. And so she said, Anita Hill said, her deliberate use of silence and voice demonstrates the power of both silence and voice, reminding us that purposeful silence resonates with meaning and intention just like that of the spoken word. So I think Anita Hill is a great example of the way in which silence is actually just as important as voice in terms of decisions about behavior, decisions about what to do, what to say, what to not say. And I think this is so I'm beginning to, this is now almost the last slide, where I'm basically laying a case for why silence can't just be seen and dismissed as something that is, something only for victims, that is something that women who are victimized do. And I think that what I've tried to argue is that silence is actually something that has a great potential. It can be used in many different places, some different sites, and it has a lot of power. I think in the last slide, I start to look more at some of the other possible ways that we can think about silence. For instance, performing silence. And Patricia Collins has discussed the way in which she said someone accused her, she said the Black community, women are not speaking out. And she just said, you have to understand that we choose what we can speak about and what we can't. And she said that African American women have used silence to protect themselves and their children, but they also use it as a site for consolidating internal resources and strategic ways to deal with the impact of race, class, and gender oppression. So basically, Patricia Collins is saying, voice is important, but there are times when silence is necessary and important also. So it's another form of power. Then there's also the issue of collective silence. And that is one of the things that really has made a big impact on me. Collective silence has turned out to be much more powerful than we thought. The mothers of the disappeared in Argentina, they were laughed at in Argentina at first. They said, what good is it for you to sit around silently every Sunday with your diapers on your head to symbolize your lost children? And yet, we know that the mothers of the disappeared played a key role in bringing down a really dreadful, sexist, militarized government. The other group that I think is a wonderful example, and there are many, many more, but the Women in Black. Women in Black movement, which is one time Cynthia Cockburn, who's involved with that movement herself, and I happened to be in London at the same time I was, and she dragged me down to one of these in Trafalgar Square. And it was very interesting because at first I get down there and there's like several hundred people in Trafalgar Square, and the traffic is going by and we're saying nothing. And I thought, wow, this is, at first I thought, well, what is this? And then I began to feel this kind of collective power that comes with standing in silently with other people. And there's a wonderful quote by Cynthia that I think summarizes it all. She says, there is something calming about vigiling, holding yourself in silence and stillness as city workers and tourists mill around you and the taxis and buses stream past. What restores me as I stand there once again in the presence of other women and men at my shoulders is the carefully thought out message we are trying to put across, and feeling hundreds of similar such meetings are occurring around the world. And so just having gone and experienced that made me realize that, you know, we so much assume, it's so easy to assume that you've got to stand up and shout and make a difference, but silent resistances can be extremely powerful, very important. So we shouldn't just overestimate the need for always to be shouting and speaking out. And we should understand that there are multiple ways of being powerful, and silence is another way that it often is possible. Then there is so collective power of silence is very important. Also, silence and voice being intertwined. And this is very interesting. I think Anita Hill made very interesting use of when to be silent and when to speak out. The Rwandan genocide survivors are also, I have a student who actually went and was in Rwanda post-genocide and actually was able to talk to people on the QT because people were afraid to speak out. But what she discovered is that the Rwandan survivors of the genocide, they will speak sometimes, and then there are other times they will not speak. That people in Rwanda have to be very careful about when they speak out and when they don't, and so that silence and voice are often sort of mixed. You have to know the circumstances. When is it okay to be silent, and when is it necessary or possible to speak? So I think silence and voice as intertwined, you know, as existing together in a relationship is very important. And there is, in one of the other chapters in the book, my Routledge book on rethinking voice and silence, voice, and agency, is the issue of silence in voice. There's a wonderful chapter by Harel Shalev and Daphne Tekoa. They interviewed women who were in the Israeli army, and they began to realize that sometimes the women they were talking to would use the word I did this, I did that, and it was usually when they were feeling very strong about the story they were telling and confident that they could express the fact that this is what I did. And then she found sometimes they shifted to you rather than I, because the you was used when certain words were not sayable, when you couldn't say I, when there were kind of ways in which it leaves open a space for silences that exists behind the words. So they shift to a word that is more generic, this general you, that detaches it from themselves. So the I is I think, I act. You becomes more, it pulls you, the person, away from the action. And so they've done this very interesting work saying that you have to understand that behind voice there are silences. Behind that shift from I to you is a silence about the fact that there's a sense of insecurity and that you probably shouldn't go there. And so I think I find this very, very interesting, and I think it's an important, it opens up for me the spaces to do more complicated and multi-leveled research, to not always look for the voice, not always look for the way in which what's spoken, and look behind the voice, or around the voice, or underneath the voice. So in conclusion, then, I think that gendered power cannot be solely linked to voice, and I think we're much too apt to think about voice and power and silence as disempowerment. So I think that moving away from that is very important. It complicates, but when you begin to read the material and then you think even about your own life and the times when you chose to say or not say things. Well, I'm sure we have all experienced that, and I think it's very important for us to understand that that's not avoidance necessary, it's a choice, it's an action. I think that's an action, so a move away or a silence can be something that is just as much agency, just as much action as a deliberate speaking out. So silence as well as voice, I think they need to be studied together. And that's what my book is claiming, that really, if we're taking silence more seriously, then don't we need to always have that in the back of our mind to look, what's being said? It's so easy for us as social scientists to think that what matters is what you hear or what's written down. But what about what you don't hear and what's not written down? I think if we begin to ask questions about the way in which silence can be very powerful and very important and make a big difference, I think that's very crucial. And then, sorry, I can't read up behind me. I think we have to understand that silence is more powerful, complex, and communicative than we have assumed. That's really what the conclusion of the book, that silence is much more powerful. It's not just being silenced, and that it is much more complicated, and that it is a form of communication that needs to be studied as seriously as we study words. And finally, the post-colonial perspective, I think, has added so much to this, because we now have to understand that silence and voice is used differently around the world. And so that if we're going to understand either, we need to understand that we need to look at local contexts, historical and current, and ask questions about, okay, how does silence operate in your society? And how does voice operate? How do they operate together? And how do they operate in relation to each other? Thank you.
Any more questions?
Yes, I'm happy to.
Thank you so much. Questions? Please line up. Microphone in the back and one in the front. This is not the time to be silent.
Right, of course. Did any of these stories resonate with your own? I mean, you come from Israel, so.
I was very skeptical, because at the beginning it sounded like something we hear from ultra-Orthodox women who've internalized their situation and say, well, yeah, we don't need a voice, this is great. Mm-hmm. But there's no question, when you got to women in black, I could relate, and I bought that. Mm-hmm. The collective silence, we often have a demonstration without a sound, and of course, right. Women in black stood there with their sign saying, end the occupation. Mm-hmm. Not a word. It drove people crazy that they wouldn't say a word. It was very effective. There's no question about it. I tend to think Anita Hill is not the best example, because like somebody who's untenured doesn't speak out. I don't think it was a choice out of strength. I think she was afraid to speak out. She found her voice. Yeah. But I think the thing that got to me in what you were saying, certainly I come with a Northern Hemisphere approach, right. and I'm sure you're absolutely right. We have to look to difference. But I'm not sure the difference is always as positive as you put it. But I go with you on the collective, and also with Ayelet Harel's research. dissociate ourselves. So she
Right.
would say, you know, you do this, or you know. But I think it's fascinating to look into more. I'm not there yet, but
You'll have to play with it for a while. Yeah, I mean, it's like looking at the work of Saba Mahmood, you know, where she's describing a world that sounds very sexist and very oppressive and really forcing women into a very dependent situation. And yet she stayed long enough. See, this may be the issue. You see, we don't live long periods of time in other people's societies. And she stayed there long enough for 2 years, embedded in it. And she finally began to see that there's a great amount of strength and power, that the women had much more. She went in thinking these women are oppressed. And then she realized they were not. And that's where we can't define, we mustn't define oppression just in terms of our own idea of what it is in our own society. We have to also understand that if people are in a situation where they find strength and resilience through the use of silence, that we need to understand that. And the only way you can do that is if you move yourself away from what you think the world should look like.
the Apaches, were the men also silent?
Yes, the rules for silence in the Apaches. And that's another thing, you know, the indigenous communities of North America all of them have a great reverence for silence. Silence is considered absolutely necessary, and the senior people who are the most powerful are the most often using silence as a weapon, as a mechanism of rule and a mechanism of also keeping certain people in line and others not, probably. But I guess for me, the book is really about the importance of us looking at silence as a serious issue that can be both positive and negative, and not just assume our definition of what it is the only definition that matters. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your great talk. I got a lot of information to think about as I am working on my book. And I have 2 questions that I think are related, and I'm still sort of working it out in my mind. I think I am like others in the audience that you talked about, sort of thinking through this. Mm-hmm. And as I think about silence as a tactic, as a strategy, also as voice, right? Mm-hmm. I think about silence in 2 ways. Silence in terms of the NFL protest with Colin Kaepernick.
Right.
And the fact that he used silence, right? Mm-hmm. But he was silenced and then dismissed. So if you can speak a little bit about when tactics like that sort of are used against that person, or what happens, and if it's colored by maybe race and gender and sports and all of those things. And then I also think about silence and social media. And I think about the response to Brett Kavanaugh's Supreme Court nomination and the fact that so many women decided to black out their social media profiles. And I think they did it for like 13 hours, and it was supposed to just be a black picture. But of course, what happens afterwards is this conversation about what happened, right? And there was a debate about whether or not it had its intended purpose. And so by that, what I mean is there was one activist who brought in a sort of racial and gendered aspect, and she said black women have long been invisible and silenced. And so she urged black women not to participate in that. And she said this sort of thing is, you know, a white woman's endeavor, right? And so there was conversation across the aisle about how useful it was. And so, again, I just want to sort of complicate or have you sort of tell us what you think about that, both in terms of sports today, but also social media, because we see that. Thank you.
Thank you. Very good questions. I mean, I think if you look at the response and the writing, the public, you know, in newspapers and TV and everywhere about the football team refusing, I thought that was a magnificent example of how you can protest silently. And I don't care. I mean, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that Trump was able to actually hurt one of the players by publicly, you know, dismissing them and everything. But I think that the impact of that, that silent, it's like a silent performance. So it's a performance that is made more powerful by being silent. If they'd stood up and started making noise, it wouldn't have been nearly as powerful as it was just by them sitting there in defiance on public television in front of millions and millions of people. And it drove Trump absolutely bonkers, which delighted me, and I'm sure most of us. But so I think we have to weigh, you know, a lot of times when you do something that is a challenge, there'll be consequences. But that doesn't mean that that challenge is unimportant. And if you weigh the two, if you weigh the impact of the performance of resistance and what happened to one person, it seems to me that it's really, really uneven. In terms of the other, remind me, I got so caught up in the first, remind me of the second just quickly.
It was about social media.
Right, social media, yeah. Well, social media, I think, is, you know, it'd be interesting to make an analysis of whether social media is just voice. You know, is it a place where we're speaking, but we're not speaking verbally, but we are speaking and being read or not read? So that's one possible way of thinking about that. But I think another way is thinking that, well, social media is also, it's another one of these mechanisms where you can resist, you can choose to close down your account if you think that what's being said is wrong. So that's a form of resisting by silencing your account. So that's another, you know, so maybe this is part of my feeling that silence and voice shouldn't be seen as opposites or different from each other. They are different, but they're connected. They're often interconnected, and their power works together in many ways. So, but I think we need to study silences and silencing very seriously, but silencing has tended to be seen always as something that's done to people with no, like, it's disempowering. But silent strategies of resistance, I mean, it's the state, you know, the common saying of the silent treatment. I mean, I remember learning about that. My mother used to do that to my father sometimes, and he went, completely off the rails over the whole thing, and she knew it. So I think that connecting them reminds us that silence has power in itself, and voice has power, and they are often interconnected. But if we have a model where we say silence is always being silenced, so it's always negative, it's always victim, and voice is always action and agency, then we can't see the way in which silence actually operates in a verbal and nonverbal world. So I'm very hoping that a lot of younger scholars will take this up and seriously begin to think about it, because especially I hope it will be done in contexts all around the world, and people will ask questions about how is silence managed in different contexts at different times among different people from different racial groups, class groups, everything. There's so many ways it can be, I think, become a powerful tool for thinking about the way in which people manage their social life and their life in general.
I'm looking at the statement that silence is more powerful, complex, and communicative than we've assumed. And I think that's so. In terms of further investigation, it occurs to me that one thing that might be interesting to look at is it seems to me that silence is likely to be most powerful when there's already equality, when there's equity in a situation, because otherwise it seems like there's manipulation. That if, and we don't want to put silence and voice as adversaries, but in terms of thinking about what it is that makes silence more powerful, I'd be interested in looking in contexts in which you start off with equality.
Well, I think, but there's very few societies where there's real equality, so I think that's almost an impossible wish. It's a nice idea, but I think that in actual fact, most societies have inequalities built into them, and I think silence, like voice, has the potential to make a difference in how those tensions work out, how they're understood, how they're spoken about, how they're not spoken about. I mean, it just for me, this approach adds some levels of questions to ask about the way in which a given society or organization or subgroup within it understands and understands itself, and then how does that come out through voice, and how does that sometimes operate in relation to silences. I think, the first time I really understood the complexity of being able to keep the power of silence is I took a course on Sufism, and I walked in and I said, "What is Sufism?" And I get this dirty look from the professor, like, "Never heard of it?" But then he started out the class, he said, "All right, everybody, I want you to say nothing for 1 minute and to keep your mind completely clear. Open your mind to just being." It was absolutely amazing. It was so incredible. I sat there, I was trying my best. I was like really focusing. Then I start thinking, let's see now, what do I need to buy for later today? I'm like, oh no, don't do you realize that our minds are there's so much stuff that goes running around. And then you realize this Sufi leader that the French were so afraid of in French West Africa, that he collected, like, he was in one area and he set up 100,000 people moved in to live with him. The French picked him up and put him deep into the desert of the Senegal Sahara. And a year later, there were another 100,000 people out there with him because they were drawn to the discipline and the inner strength required to do the kind of contemplation and insights that Sufism requires. And so, if you look at a world like that, or you look at the Trappist monks who don't speak for weeks and weeks and months, and the power, what is the power for them in that? But just the fact that it's so hard to get yourself to actually think, not have a thought in your mind for a minute, that really got me curious, and I stayed in the course, and it was a huge impact on me. But so I think we need to think about both silence and voice together, and not separate them, and not make one less important than the other. I think it depends on circumstances, but I think it's very important to do that. And it's a challenge that I throw out to all of you.
My question is just,
thinking of silence, I'm thinking what you're saying, it could be the person who is oppressed being silent. And I'm thinking when you're in power and you become silent and I want you to say something, you are in power. Then I'm wondering how that dynamic works, right? Like the previous speaker said, right, there's that equality and then that's where the silence interplays. How can that be? But now I'm thinking, okay, if the ones in power are silent and the oppressed want you to talk, how does that interplay and how can that work?
That's a very complicated question, I think. I think we have to, I think we need a lot more research on this, but I think that we have to understand that there are a lot of religions in particular, but there are a lot of institutions that think that silent reflection is a very important form of behavior. They see it as just as important as speaking out and acting. And so I think that we need to understand that we have to think about different ways in which people understand themselves and the importance of speaking out or not speaking out. And it's very complicated, and I'm feeling like I'm not saying the words are not quite refined enough and things, but I just want to take everyone with me down this journey, and I hope it won't ruin your life or anything, but, but I mean, it is really intriguing to be able to think that, well, sometimes when there's silence, we need to ask the question in our mind, what does silence sometimes mean? What does it mean to me? What does it mean to the person who is using silence as a way of dealing with their life?
Maybe perhaps this is not a question, but two things you might be able to reflect on. One phrase which has been running through my mind throughout most of your talk is a phrase I have heard, there is no ear to hear and no heart to understand. So we need to create space that will accept whatever is said. And through my investigations into Native American peoples and their talking circles, in passing the talking stick, there is a required silence before the next speaker begins so that there is respectful reflection on what has previously been said, and so you do not get into this intense emotional interchange. And you can, with this time of reflection, move from what one person has said to another.
Right.
So, I don't know how that all ties together, but
It's very fascinating, but it fits in with this notion of that we really mustn't think of silence as something is just done to you, being silenced, because it's used by people and organizations and in many different ways. But it can be very powerful, and if we ignore it, if we don't see it, if it's just invisible, we're missing out on a lot of how a given society is understanding itself and organizing itself. Does that make sense? So I've thrown you into a very complicated world, but it's...
Thank you. Thank you
It is
so much,
exciting to be
Dr.
working on
Parpart.
something new.
Let me thank you, and let me just say this. I think what you've touched upon is it is a very complex topic, and it's really multifaceted. There's so many layers to it, and so many contexts, if I may put it that way. But there's also, I mean, for me, you touched upon this concept of an inner peace or an inner place where it's nice to go to that place and not to have to worry about things to say and not to say and all of that. And also the whole notion of how does a society sometimes use silence rather than always voice?
Yeah.
I mean, I really wonder about all these different facets. So it's complex, so that there's all this perplexity is a good thing. I hope you realize. So I think more research is needed, quite frankly. So thank you so much for that wonderful, wonderful presentation.
Thank you.